Before I tell you this story, I need you to understand something about the kind of country we're talking about. We're talking about a country that told its black citizens they were free, and then spent the next 100 years making sure that freedom meant as little as possible. We're talking about a country where a black man could be dragged out of his home and murdered in the street, and the newspaper would print a story blaming him for it. We're talking about a country where an entire community of black Americans built something so extraordinary, so powerful, so undeniable, that the only response America could come up with was to burn it to the ground and then lie about it for 80 years. In 1921, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was a place called the Greenwood District. They called it the Negro Wall Street. 600 black-owned businesses, hospitals, hotels, law offices, 2 newspapers, schools, a library, a theater, a private airplane, an entire economy built from nothing inside a system that was designed to keep black people poor. And it worked. It worked so brilliantly that a single dollar would change hands 19 times within that community before it ever left. 19 times. And then, on the morning of June 1st, 1921, it was gone. All of it, burned to the ground by a white mob while the police watched, while city officials stood by, while airplanes circled overhead and fired into the streets below. Gone in 16 hours, and for the next 80 years, America pretended it never happened. No charges, no arrests, no compensation, no acknowledgement, just silence. I'm going to tell you everything: the rise, the people who built it, the lie that started the fire, the 16 hours that destroyed it, and the century-long cover-up that followed. This is the full story of Black Wall Street, and I promise you, by the time we're done, you will never look at this country the same way again. 1865. The Civil War is over. 400 years of slavery are officially, legally, on paper, done, and black Americans are told they are free. Now, I want you to think about what that actually meant. It didn't mean 40 acres and a mule. That promise was made and broken within months. The land that had been seized from Confederate slaveholders and briefly given to freed black families, President Andrew Johnson took it back, handed it straight back to the men who had owned slaves on it, the people who had worked that land for generations, who had quite literally built the wealth of the entire American South with their hands and their bodies. Were told to return it. Free meant free to wander, free to starve, free with no land, no money, no tools, no education, because it had been illegal in many states to teach enslaved people to read. Free, but with nothing to show for 400 years of stolen labor. There was a moment, a brief, extraordinary moment, called Reconstruction. Black men were elected to Congress, black schools opened, black newspapers published, black communities grew. For a few years, it genuinely looked like America might keep its promise. Then the backlash came. The Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1865, the same year slavery ended. Not years later, not a generation later, the same year. From the very first moment black Americans were free, there were organized and violent forces dedicated to making sure that freedom meant nothing. Black politicians were assassinated. Churches were burned. Entire communities were terrorized into silence. By 1877, the federal government had walked away from Reconstruction entirely, sacrificed black lives on the altar of political compromise. And in their place came Jim Crow, segregation by law, separate schools, separate hospitals, separate water fountains, separate everything except the work. The work black Americans were still expected to do. And behind all of it, always, was the threat of violence. Lynching was not rare in America. The NICP documented over 4,000 lynchings between 1877 and 1950. Men, women, children murdered publicly, sometimes photographed, sometimes turned into postcards that people mailed to each other like souvenirs. Postcards. That was the America that black people were navigating every single day. And yet, some people refused to accept the story America had written for them. Some people looked at what this country said they could never have, and built it anyway. His name was O.W. Gurley, born in 1868. 3 years after emancipation, the son of a man who had been enslaved. He worked, he studied. He earned a college degree at a time when most black Americans had no access to education at all. He became a school principal. He had made something of himself, something real, within the narrow lane that America allowed him. But Gurley had bigger dreams than a narrow lane. In 1906, he arrived in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He looked at a strip of undeveloped land just north of the railroad tracks, on the black side of the invisible line the city had drawn, and he bought 40 acres. And he made one rule. He would sell that land only to black buyers. It sounds simple. In 1906 America, it was revolutionary. What Gurley was creating was a protected space, an economic harbor, a place where black families could own something without the constant threat of having it seized, rezoned, burned, or stolen through the legal system, would spread like a fire of its own kind. A black attorney named B.C. Franklin set up his law practice on Greenwood Avenue. A doctor followed, a dentist, a pharmacist, a hotel owner, a grocer, a theater owner. Families came from across Oklahoma, from across the South, people who were tired of sharecropping, tired of Jim Crow, tired of building on land that kept getting taken from them. In Greenwood, they could own something, and so they built. By 1921, the Greenwood District had over 600 black-owned businesses. Let me say that again, 600, in one neighborhood, in one city. They had 2 newspapers, a hospital, a library, a hotel, the Stratford Hotel, one of the largest black-owned hotels in the entire country. They had law offices and medical practices, and churches and schools, and a theater, and a confectionery, and an auto repair shop, and a private airplane. A black man in 1921 Oklahoma owned a private airplane. That man's name was Simon Berry, and his story alone could fill an entire video. But the number that tells you everything, the number that explains exactly why what happened next happened, is 19. A single dollar earned in Greenwood would circulate through the community 19 times before it ever left. Doctor to grocer, grocer to seamstress, seamstress to lawyer, lawyer to hotel owner. 19 hands, 19 exchanges, 19 moments of black wealth staying black. Today, in the average black American community, a dollar leaves within 6 hours. The people of Greenwood had cracked the code of economic self-sufficiency that the entire American system was designed to prevent them from ever finding. When Booker T. Washington visited, one of the most powerful and respected black voices in American history, he looked at Greenwood and he searched for words. And what he said became part of history. This is the Negro Wall Street. Not a metaphor, not a dream, a reality. A thriving, brilliant, self-sustaining black economy, built from nothing, in the middle of one of the most racist eras in American history. And that, right there, was the problem. Because in a country built on the idea that black people were inferior, a community this successful was not an inspiration to the white people around it. It was a threat, not a threat with weapons, not a threat with violence, something worse. It was proof. Proof that everything they had told themselves, every justification they had built for 400 years of oppression, was a lie. And some people will burn down the truth before they let it destroy their lie. His name was Dick Rowland, 19 years old. He shined shoes for a living, a common job for a young black man in Tulsa in 1921. His stand was in the white commercial district downtown. The bathroom on his floor was for white customers only, so when he needed to use a restroom during the day, he had to take a separate elevator up to a floor where black people were permitted. The elevator was operated by a 17-year-old white girl named Sarah Page. On May 30th, 1921, Dick Rowland stepped into that elevator. The doors closed, and something happened. What exactly? No one fully knows. Historians believe he may have tripped on the gate and grabbed her arm to catch himself. She may have cried out, startled. He panicked because a black teenager in 1921, Oklahoma understood at bone-deep level what it meant to be accused of touching a white woman, and he ran. That is everything that happened. A stumble, A startled cry, a terrified boy, running not because he was guilty, but because he understood exactly what an accusation could cost him. Sarah Page herself later said she did not want to press charges. The woman whose name was used to justify the destruction of an entire community tried to tell people that nothing had happened. Nobody listened. The next morning, on May 31st, 1921, the Tulsa Tribune ran a headline, "Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator." No evidence, no investigation, no established facts. Just a headline, written as verdict, published as truth, and it was enough. By that afternoon, a white mob had gathered outside the Tulsa courthouse where Dick Rowland was being held. Hundreds of men, armed, demanding he be brought out, demanding a lynching. Lynching wasn't an abstract fear in 1921. It was a documented reality. Hundreds of black men had been murdered this way, in this era, in this country. Dick Rowland knew it. Every black person in Tulsa knew it. And then word reached Greenwood. Black veterans of World War I heard what was happening at the courthouse. These were men who had crossed an ocean to fight for America. Men who had survived the trenches of France, who had bled under the American flag, who had come home expecting, maybe just quietly hoping, that their service had earned them something. It hadn't. They came home to the same Jim Crow, the same segregation, the same threat. But these men were veterans. They had weapons, and they were not going to stand by while another black man was dragged out and murdered. About 75 of them went to the courthouse. Armed, they stood between Dick Rowland and the mob. The two groups faced each other in the Oklahoma night. A white man from the crowd approached one of the black veterans and demanded he hand over his gun. The veteran said no. A shot rang out. Nobody knows who fired it, and honestly, it doesn't matter. Because what happened next had nothing to do with that gunshot. What happened next had been waiting to happen for years. I need to be very clear about the word we use for what happened next. For 100 years, America called it a riot. A riot as if it were chaos, as if it were mutual, as if both sides equally lost control on a street corner somewhere. That is a lie. What happened in Greenwood on June 1st, 1921, was not a riot. It was an invasion. It was organized. It was methodical. It was carried out with the full support, and in many cases, the direct participation of the Tulsa City Police, city officials, and the Oklahoma National Guard. While the confrontation outside the courthouse was still unfolding, while the night was still dark, white men across Tulsa were arming themselves and gathering in organized groups on the edge of Greenwood, and the Tulsa police were doing something extraordinary. They were walking through those crowds and pinning badges on them, deputizing civilians, ordinary men with no training, no accountability, no restraint, and sending them into the black community, not to keep order, to destroy it. By dawn on June the 1st, the mob numbered in the thousands, and they moved into Greenwood like an army, street by street, block by block. The pattern was always the same. First, they looted. They went into the homes and businesses and took everything of value: jewelry, cash, furniture, instruments, clothing. They carried out the possessions that black families had spent lifetimes accumulating. Then they poured the kerosene. Then they struck the match. Families were dragged from their beds at gunpoint, made to kneel in the streets with their hands above their heads while their homes burned behind them. Those who ran were shot. Those who surrendered were arrested. The Tulsa jail filled up, then the convention hall, then the fairgrounds. 10,000 black residents, the survivors of their own community being destroyed around them, were locked up. Not the attackers, the survivors. And then the planes appeared. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like something from a different era, a different country. But it is documented. It is in survivor testimonies recorded independently over decades. It is in National Guard records, at least a dozen planes, circled above the burning Greenwood District as the massacre unfolded below. Survivors reported shots fired downward from those planes. Some described incendiary devices being dropped onto buildings that hadn't yet caught fire. The 1921 Tulsa Massacre was one of the first times in American history that an American city was attacked from the air by Americans against Americans on American soil. By 10 o'clock in the morning, just a few hours after sunrise, it was over. And this is where I need you to really hear me. 35 city blocks gone. 1,256 homes burned to ash. Every single one. Over 600 businesses, the hotels, the law offices, the hospital, the library, the theater, the grocery stores, the pharmacies, gone. 21 churches burned. Schools burned. 300 black Americans confirmed killed. Historians believe the true number is much higher. Bodies were buried in mass graves. Some were thrown into the Arkansas River. Many were never identified, never counted, never mourned publicly by anyone with the power to make the world listen. 10,000 people left homeless in June in Oklahoma, with no food, no shelter, no help, and no apology. In 16 hours, everything those people had built, every sacrifice, every late night, every dollar saved, every dream passed from parent to child, wiped from the earth in 16 hours. And Dick Rowland. The charges were dropped. Sarah Page refused to cooperate. He was released and left Tulsa quietly, never to be heard from publicly again. He spent the rest of his life knowing that his name had been used to justify the murder of hundreds of his people. Think about what it means to carry that. How America buried the truth. Here is where the story becomes, in its own way, as monstrous as the massacre itself, because murder, as devastating as it is, can be known. It can be named. It can be prosecuted. The truth of it can survive. But what America did to the truth of what happened in Greenwood was something else entirely. It was a slow, deliberate, institutional erasure, and it worked for 80 years. The morning after the massacre, while the ash was still warm, the Tulsa City Commission met, and they passed a new zoning ordinance. Overnight, rezoning the Greenwood area for industrial use, which meant that legally, the black residents, who had just survived the destruction of everything they owned, could not rebuild their homes and businesses on their own land. The plan was not subtle. Use the law to finish what the fire had started. Take the land. Push the community out permanently. A black lawyer named B.C. Franklin fought that ordinance in court. He argued from a tent because his office had been burned down. He won. The ordinance was struck down as unconstitutional, and so the survivors rebuilt. With no insurance money, every single claim had been denied. With no government assistance, with no compensation of any kind, they picked up the bricks and started again. No one was ever arrested. No one was ever charged. A grand jury was convened. They looked at the evidence of 300 people killed, 1,200 homes burned, an entire community destroyed, and they concluded that the black residents of Greenwood had instigated the violence. The victims were handed the blame, and then the silence came. Oklahoma schools didn't teach it. The city of Tulsa didn't acknowledge it. The newspapers that had helped incite it went quiet. A fund that was proposed to help survivors was never funded. A memorial that was discussed was never built. For the children growing up in Tulsa in the 1930s, the 40s, the 50s, black and white alike, the massacre was a whisper. Something old people mention sometimes. Something you weren't supposed to ask too many questions about. But the survivors knew. Olivia Hooker was 2 years old on June 1st, 1921. She remembered men in uniform coming into her family home. She remembered watching them lift her father's violin out of its case. She remembered the look on her father's face as they smashed it on the floor. She walked out of that house and saw the smoke rising over Greenwood. Olivia Hooker went on to become a psychologist, a university professor, the first black woman to serve in the United States Coast Guard. She testified before Congress. She told her story everywhere she could, to anyone who would listen. She lived to be 103 years old, and she spent most of that life watching America refuse to listen. Her voice deserved to be heard decades earlier. They all did. Say their names. I've given you numbers, facts, history, dates. Now I want to give you something more important than all of that. I want to give you people. O.W. Gurley, the man who started it all, who looked at a strip of undeveloped land in Oklahoma, and saw a future that nobody else could imagine. He survived the massacre, but watching everything he had built burn to the ground took something from him that never fully came back. He eventually left Tulsa and rebuilt his life in California. He died in 1935. He never fully saw his life's work recognized as the miracle it was. He deserved to. Dr. AC Jackson, the Mayo Clinic called him the most able black surgeon in America. Not the most able surgeon in Oklahoma. Not the most able surgeon in the South. In America, he had patients of every race who sought him out specifically. He was brilliant, humble, and beloved. On the morning of June 1st, when the mob came to his door, Dr. Jackson walked out with his hands raised above his head. He was not going to fight. He was compliant. He was cooperative. He surrendered completely. They shot him dead in his front yard anyway. He was 47 years old. Think about every life he would have saved. Mabel Little. She was 22 years old when the massacre happened. She ran a beauty salon. She ran a rooming house. She had her whole life ahead of her, and she was already building something real. She lost everything in 16 hours. And then she came back. She stayed in Greenwood for the rest of her life, rebuilding, helping others rebuild, holding the community together through sheer force of will. She told the story until she physically couldn't anymore. She lived to be 97 years old. John Williams. He built the Dreamland Theater, 750 seats, a palace where black Tulsans could dress up, sit down in comfort, watch a film, and feel, for just a couple of hours, like the world had been built for them too. He stood outside and watched it burn. And then there are the 300, at minimum. Historians believe the real number is far higher. Bodies buried in mass graves, some thrown into the river, many never found. Never named, never counted. They had names. They had families. They had favorite songs and morning routines and things they were looking forward to. America treated them like they were nothing. They were not nothing, and we will not let them be forgotten. The debt that was never paid. Someone will say, and they always do, why are we still talking about something that happened 100 years ago? I want to answer that question directly, and honestly, because the consequences are still here. Right now today, the average white family in America has roughly 8 to 10 times the wealth of the average black family. 8 to 10 times. That gap did not happen because of difference in talent or ambition or character. It happened because of history, because of what was built and what was taken. Wealth is not just money in a bank account. Wealth is the house your grandparents owned that they left to your parents. The business they built, the education fund they saved, the safety net that lets you take a risk because you have something beneath you. Wealth is what gets passed from one generation to the next. And in Greenwood, in Rosewood, Florida, in Bruce's Beach, California, in black community after black community across this country, that generational foundation was burned, seized, buried, destroyed, over and over, every time it began to take root. After the Greenwood Massacre, the survivors were denied insurance. Redlining policies prevented black families from getting mortgages in their own neighborhoods. Federal highway projects bulldozed black communities to build roads for white suburbs. The GI Bill that created the white middle class after World War II was administered in ways that largely excluded black veterans. Every generation, another door closed, another ladder pulled up, another foundation burned before it could be built. And then, when the wealth gap is documented and discussed, people ask why. This is why. In 2001, the Oklahoma State Commission finally investigated the massacre. They confirmed what survivors had always said. They recommended reparations for survivors and their descendants. Not a single cent was ever paid. In 2021, on the 100th anniversary, President Biden stood in Greenwood. 3 survivors were in the front row. The youngest of them was 100 years old. They had waited a century to hear an American president say the word. He said it, he called it a massacre. He called it wrong. He called it one of the worst acts of racial violence in American history. And still, no reparations, no accountability. no payment of the debt. The story of Black Wall Street is not a closed chapter. It is a wound that was never treated, a debt that was never paid, a reckoning that this country has been avoiding for 100 years. How much longer? In the rubble of Greenwood, after the fires had gone cold, after the mob had scattered, after the soldiers had locked up the survivors and the lawyers, had rezoned their land, the people came back. Mabel Little came back. B.C. Franklin came back. Families with nothing left but each other came back to the ash and the rubble of their world, and they started again, by hand, from nothing, the same way they had built it the first time, because that is who these people were. The fire destroyed the buildings. The silence nearly destroyed the story, but it did not. Because the story lives as long as someone is willing to tell it, as long as we say the names O.W. Gurley, Dr. AC Jackson, Mabel Little, John Williams, Simon Berry, Olivia Hooker, Dick Rowland. The fire did not fully win. So I'm asking you to do one thing. Tell someone. Tell your children. Tell your parents. Send this video to someone who has never heard of Greenwood. Put the name Black Wall Street into the world wherever you can. Because for 80 years, the people who burned it down were counting on the silence. They were counting on the story dying with the last survivors. Don't give them that. The least we can do, the absolute minimum, we owe to the people of Greenwood, is to make sure the world knows what was built, what was taken, what was never paid back. Remember them. That is all they ever asked. Remember them.